Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about housing theory today, specifically like commodification of housing, gentrification, and slumification. So just to introduce myself, my name is Talia, and I'm an organizer with Omaha Tenants United. I also am a graduate student at the University of Nebraska, Omaha in urban studies. So I generally keep my focus on housing, but really as on housing in like the broader landscape of a city and its geography. So especially ways that like city governments and developers work together to kind of gentrify cities and how that entire system functions. I also host a podcast that I just always got to plug, Tenants United podcast. So I just try to feature different tenant organizers on there, and we talk about organizing and organizational structure. So if you're interested in that, we generally feature different tenant unions, kind of sharing their stories and trying to put that out there as a resource too. But that's a little bit about me. Julian is also presenting today. Julian, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, that's my name. I like to be called that in the third person also, rather than pronouns. And I'm with tenant and neighborhood councils. We're in the Bay Area. I'm specifically in Oakland. And just my background, I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. I published articles in Shelter Force magazine, Commune magazine, a few other places, the Radical Housing Journal, on tenants movements and sort of theories of tenant struggle. Yeah, so that's me.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about why it's important to know theory or think about theory. So theory really is what has to do with ideas, and it's more than just, any random ideas that you have, of course, but it's ideas that are based on some type of research or some type of based in something. So I think it's really important to know that and kind of know how systems are working and what exactly is happening, because you kind of need to understand a problem before you can find a solution to it. And so praxis is taking that theory and taking those ideas and applying them to what we're doing in organizing. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about commodification of housing, uneven development or gentrification and slumification, and then how we can organize for radical housing solutions based on some of these theories. So to start with a definition of commodification of housing, one thing that's important to know is that everything has a use value and an exchange value. So a use value is the value that you get just from using something, right? It meets your need. It's literally just how you use it, right? And an exchange value, though, is what that's worth when you try to exchange it. So when you try to exchange it for money, what its monetary value is. So commodification then is when the exchange value dominates the use value, and we start seeing that things aren't considered important based on how they're used or how they meet needs, but they're important based on how much people can profit from them. So like in terms of housing, it's not necessarily being provided to meet a need. It's not being provided so that people can live there, but it's being provided so that landlords or property owners or developers can profit from it. This is something that's really been especially happening in the neoliberal era. So since like the 1970s in particular, it's been a pretty long time before housing has ever not been a commodity in the United States, right? There's always been some exchange value attached to it, but especially since the neoliberal era, when they've started to dismantle the public housing system, we've really seen that housing is not being provided, in particular by government, for a need anymore. Instead, it's being governments are subsidizing public housing so that there can still be some profit to the landlord instead of providing it directly. So one example that I have in Omaha is this is a public housing complex that was built in, I think, the 1940s in Omaha. It's a bunch of units, it's very dense, but the plan now is that the city has actually gotten a grant to destroy those homes and build mixed use housing in its place. So it's not necessarily anything against like mixed income level housing inherently, but I think this is a really good example of how there's going to be a bunch of people displaced from this because the government is no longer going to be just providing all of is not going to be providing just this housing anymore. There's going to be a lot of subsidies that are being used, and there's going to be some people are going to have their housing provided by the government there, and some of them are not. So here's a quote about commodification of housing. The commodification of housing means that a structure's function as real estate takes precedence over its usefulness as a place to live. When this happens, housing's role as an investment outweighs all other claims upon it. And so I had another example from Omaha on this one about housing not really being considered to meet a need, but instead of just being considered as an investment. So these are a development project in Park Avenue in Omaha. And so this is a gentrifying neighborhood that's almost entirely renters. It's a really dense neighborhood. And I once went to a meeting there about a year ago that was held by developers. And the idea of it was supposed to be, like a community development meeting where they get input from the people who live there about how they want to change the neighborhood, and then they don't listen to any of it, right? But one thing that I found really interesting was they had everybody write on sticky notes one thing that they would change about the neighborhood. And every person was putting something like nicer trash receptacles, more lighting, more bus stops. Literally nobody was saying condos or townhomes that cost $300,000, which is expensive for Omaha, might not be for everyone else here. Yet the developers still held this meeting and were saying like, look at all these needs that we're meeting for housing in this neighborhood, right? They weren't actually, and they still aren't, meeting the need for housing for any of the people who already live there. It's a very low income neighborhood. And obviously the people that live there, for the most part, already live there and have housing, right? And so they're going to actually be getting displaced, not meeting that need, but meeting the need for housing as an investment tool for people to make money from. So what we're also seeing happening is the hyper-commodification of housing. So under hyper-commodification, the capacity of a building to function as a home becomes secondary, and what matters is how a building functions in circuits of economic accumulation. So basically that use value or meeting a need doesn't matter at all anymore, and what only matters is that investment potential. So one way that hyper-commodification of housing happens is through deregulation. So removing those restrictions that keep real estate from being only a commodity, removing regulations like mortgage regulations, rent control, getting rid of rent control, which would obviously keeps that maximum profit that landlords could be making lower. So removing that so that they can profit more, continue to sell housing, destabilize rent. And again, that sale of public housing, because there used to be a lot of restrictions on whether the government could actually sell public housing, and they weren't allowed to sell it to private developers. And most of those have been completely deregulated. Financialization as well. So not only is the housing a commodity, but the tools that they use to sell housing is a commodity. So mortgages, people buy homes just so that they can make money off of the mortgages, and people invest in mortgages in other people's mortgages, so that many people technically own the mortgage on one specific place. And they're all making money, not just from that house, but from the interest that they're making on the mortgage. And this leads to housing being a financial product. And finally, globalization. We got into this in our breakout group this morning. I'm not sure how much other people did, but especially as we're thinking about Atun and thinking about how many landlords own buildings in places where they don't live, not only across North America, but in other countries too. And so this again decouples or separates what people's actual housing needs are from how housing is being bought and sold, because people are buying and selling it just for the money that they're making off of it in completely different places. not because of what people in that community actually need. And so the capitalist logic for how we can get housing to people is they're generally going to be talking about supply and demand. So they'll say that the solution to affordable housing is to build more housing. We've also been talking about how, of course, affordable is not necessarily our goal. And the way that they measure affordable is not exactly always accurate too, right? But we're just for the purpose of this using like the affordable housing definition that's most common and accepted. And so they think that if you increase the supply of housing, it will lower the demand, and as a result, it will lower the price, right? So they think if we just provide more housing, then less people will need homes. There won't be as many people wanting to get those homes, so the price will fall because the demand is lower. But because of this hyper-commodification, there's a demand for housing that no one will ever actually live in. So increasing supply of housing doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to decrease the demand for housing to actually live in. So I included here a picture of condos that are owned by Mutual of Omaha Insurance Company in Omaha. And I don't know how factually true this is, but it's always been rumored that at least half of these condos are empty at any given time. And whether they are or not, this was not built to provide housing. They knocked over so much housing to build these condos. This was built as somewhere for this insurance company to put their money and to hold on to it, right? So just building more housing doesn't necessarily mean that the price is going to go down. Another reason for that is because new construction is expensive. So even if we're talking about providing affordable housing, new builds are usually going to be built for market rate or above, and they're not going to be built for affordable. So instead, the developer or government solution is often subsidizing developments to make them profitable, or trickle down housing, which means basically leaving the old units. Then as they deteriorate, they'll get cheaper. And so just, let the people who can't afford luxury apartments live in those. So again, not only is the goal through this logic, not even to provide housing for all, but it can't even provide housing for all or affordable housing. And it's actually cheaper in most cases for governments to actually just provide the housing directly than it is to subsidize landlords. But because of that deregulation and because of all the sale and commodification of public housing, it's really hard once the private like real estate lobbies have gotten a hold of something and they've been able to deregulate and get that, it's really hard to move that back. So even if it's cheaper for governments, they often still just continue subsidizing. So instead of just providing housing to tenants, they're paying landlords to provide housing to tenants so that they're still creating that profit. And one example that I had for this, this was a campaign that Omaha Tenants United went on to stop a slumlord from getting a tax break. But I wanted to bring up what that tax break is and what it's for. It's literally to make not profitable developments profitable, right? So the government will give a developer just enough money to incentivize them to develop in an area and do it. And they're only supposed to do it if the project wouldn't be profitable otherwise. But even with that, in 2018, all of the TIF projects that were approved in Omaha to build apartments, only 7% of those were considered affordable. And the rest were market rate and luxury. So even with that subsidy, there was no production of affordable, quote unquote, housing. And so now we're going to stop for a little bit of discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Julian for that.
Excellent. So first, we've got some community agreements. I'll just introduce them, and if people have questions about any of them, we can talk about that for a minute, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk. So be curious, open, and respectful of each other. No one knows everything. Together we know a lot. We can't be articulate all the time, so don't worry about if your words aren't coming out the way you want. It's all right. We understand. Confidentiality. If anyone discloses something private, well, I guess that's actually not relevant in this situation because we're recording. I guess we could pause the recording if somebody feels like it's crucial to disclose something private. one mic, one voice at a time. So I'll be facilitating, calling people on Stack so that we make sure we can do that. Take space, make space. So if you're someone that's often shy, feel encouraged. There's a bunch of comrades in this virtual room. We want to hear from you. And if you're someone that often talks, maybe thinking about listening a bit more to this conversation. And the last thing, be aware of your airtime. Any questions about any of those agreements, just quickly? Okay, I'm not hearing any, so let's go to the next one. So I feel like discussion is often more productive if people have time to think about questions a little bit first. So we're going to keep these questions up for about, let's do 2 minutes. And if you have a notebook or if you're on your computer, you can take notes. And you don't have to come up with responses to all of them, of course, and we're probably not going to have a chance to hear from everyone on every topic, but definitely at least find the one that really is important for you. And I know also some people had questions in the chat about the ideas. So maybe one of the questions some of you might have is clarifying the ideas. So we'll have time to talk about those too. So we'll start those couple of minutes now, and then we'll reconvene and I'll let you know when we'll get started. Okay, great. Let's get the conversation going here. And I saw that there's several comments already in the chat, so why don't we start with those? I'm seeing, I think, Empty and Jordan asking about how the landlords and developers continue to make profits if they're mostly empty. Does that feel like that's an accurate reflection of your question, folks?
Yes, like how do they have to make their money back, but if no one's living in them, they're not getting that money.
Right. And I see Rachel wrote an answer. Rachel, do you want to respond?
I'm sure. Here in LA, we do have, like I wrote, tens of thousands, literally, of empty housing units that were built, and they are purposefully kept empty by developers. And the idea is that when housing is looked at as a commodity, just like gold or anything else, the value of that commodity can fluctuate over time. But when we're talking about real estate, unless there's like a housing bubble like we had 10, 12 years ago, real estate only goes up in value usually. And so they can sit on, they've got the money to be able to build these units, basically parking that investment money. And then waiting over time, and it could take 10, 20 years, whatever it takes till they hit, for the property to appreciate, until they hit where they want to get out of that commodity. And then they just sell it at that point. And so that allows them to make money without having to ever rent a single unit. That's my understanding of why they keep these units empty.
Excellent, Rachel. Thanks for that. I think that's very clear. Appreciate that. And then I'm seeing next in the stack we have Jeremy with the theory question.
Yeah, thanks. Also, this is really informative. Thanks for putting it on. I had a question about the commodification. Can you kind of break down the difference between the builder extracting, commodifying housing as a thing of buying and selling a unit, house flipping, versus profit through the extraction of rent? Also, does anybody know how to pronounce rent? Is it rentier, rentier? How do you pronounce that word? Anyway.
There's some great questions, Jeremy. And I guess I'll just, I can answer on I've heard both rentier and rentier. And I can also say, I'll be presenting on a panel tomorrow where I'll kind of respond to the first question a little bit, but I wonder if anybody has comments on Jeremy's topic in terms of the breakdown of the housing commodity, which parts of profit are which. Yeah, I mean, I guess since no one's stepping in, I can just personally respond. There's this passage that, so in a classic that I think is worth reading, but there's a lot that's not useful in at this point, but it's still, useful at some level, is the Engels essay, the housing question. And he has a section in there where he kind of talks about, the breakdown of rent, the different parts of it. So one part is the ground rent. That's the profit that just comes from the land. One part of it is the profit, the interest that goes to paying back to the builder. Another part goes to making the repairs and paying for insurance. And I think it's a huge difficulty to really know which parts of which are going into that without having access to individual landlords' accounting. So I think we just kind of know in general that when we talk about housing as a commodity, it's a complex commodity that has these different parts that maybe come from different sources. And I think that maybe easier thing to recognize sometimes is when there's this hyper commodification going on, and we can find that based on certain information around mortgages is publicly accessible. We've definitely had some access around that through the COVID related events. So that's maybe one point of access on that. Monica, I see you also have a question here. Do you want to share your question? Or maybe I can read it and see if anybody wants to respond. How can we tell if developers are building affordable housing or for-profit housing? And their requests need to be approved by the city council, right? Does anyone have experience with that in where they live?
Can you repeat? I missed it. Sorry.
I can touch on it a little bit because I actually used to work for the city council here in Omaha, and at least here, in terms of needing to be approved by city council, here developers really only usually needed to get approved if they need to change zoning or something like that, that there's like something about the legal structure would have to be changed, or they would have to get permits approved or something by the city. If what they're building is already okay within that zoning, then they just need to get the construction permits and all of that. But the city actually then doesn't have as many ways that they could actually stop the development. I suppose if people really pressured them to, they probably could, but generally if there's nothing legally in the way of that development already, then they can usually go forward. And then in terms of developers building affordable housing or for-profit housing, usually the affordable housing standards that people usually refer to are set by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So that again kind of depends on the process that they're going through. The reason why I knew for the TIF projects is because they put together a report, and they generally require that the developers applying for it say what type of housing they're providing. So they'll say this is going to be lower income housing, or they'll say this is going to be market rate housing, or this is going to be luxury housing. And often they'll have other tax credits that they can get if it's lower income housing too. So generally you just know by what types of things they're applying for.
Thanks for that, Talia.
I
And
could,
Rob, I see you've got a question here. Do you want to share that?
if
Rachel,
I,
was your response directly to that last point?
yeah, I did. I actually did.
Okay, why don't you go?
I'm here in Los Angeles. I'm the president of my neighborhood council, and I'm very much plugged into what City Hall does here. And basically, it comes down to what we consider when we're talking about the planning department, what's on menu and what's off menu as to what gets approved by the city. And anything that's on menu, in other words, by right, that just automatically gets approved. But then if there's things that are off menu, then those kinds of things do normally need to go through city council. But my experience, at least here in Los Angeles, is that very rarely will the city council members actually knock down a project. They would just, they normally just go ahead and approve anyway. And that's zoning changes or any kind of, if they want increased mass and things like that. So Monica, I don't know what city you live in, but if you really want to do a deep dive into it, talk to your planning department and find out what kinds of things are on menu, and then look at some of the things that are being asked for off menu. And then as far as doing activism, and trying to fight back, get with your council members, and show some, get some folks together, show some solidarity, and try to stop some of the off menu types of things, because get them to not do off menu stuff, get them to knock it down. Sometimes then the project becomes untenable for the developer. If any of that makes sense.
Excellent, thanks, Rachel. That was helpful. I wasn't aware of that difference, the on menu, off menu. So we've got about a minute more for discussion in this part. I thought one of these questions, the next question here was pretty useful. So I don't know if everybody looked at the chat. Maybe we could I'll read it really quick. And then
my thing.
Maybe we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Or rather, we can talk about Ricky's question. So Rob shared what would it actually mean to decommodify housing? We have examples of decommodified public good, transit, primary education, parks. It's obviously better for these goods not to be commodities, but the fact that they're provided by the state doesn't mean they're provided well and equitably. There's a more fundamental problem of the capitalist system that produces all this inequality. I think we're mostly Reds. We shouldn't hesitate to say there's a deeper problem with society than the fact that this one good is a commodity. And then let's see, no, it was actually Jordan. So Jordan, why don't we hear your question, and maybe we can just think about it as we go into this next section, and we can pick up talking about it if we want to in the next discussion. So Justin, do you want to share your question really quick? Did I say Justin? I meant Jordan.
Oop, let's see. One question I have is, what is a good response to mixed income housing and affordable housing schemes? I know this is a lot to LA Tenants Union core value, but I felt confused about what this really means. And then you dropped that in the chat, which was helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that question, Jordan. Let's try to think about it, and maybe folks will want to check out that article. And Talia, do you want to pick up the next section?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these questions I think are really good in leading us into the other two sections that we're going to talk about, which are uneven development of housing, and then after that we'll start talking about organizing alternatives, which I think will get into that question of what does decommodified housing look like. So this is we kind of discussed what commodification of housing looks like just at the economic level. But what's also happening is that the housing system works on a geographic and neighborhood level. So why do we see some neighborhoods develop, but others don't? Develop in quotation marks, because I think we can all question the standard definition of development usually means developers coming in. So why do some landlords maintain their properties and others don't if they're all trying to profit from that property? And why do some neighborhoods and buildings become more expensive to live in and others don't? So one answer to these questions is the theory of uneven development. So this is a geography theory, mostly popularized by David Harvey and some of his students, and it applies some Marxist ideas to geography. One of those being that capitalists always need to continue increasing profits, right? So they've got to, in order to stay competitive, they need to be making more and more money. But profit has to come from somewhere. Everybody can't profit at equal levels. So thinking about profit coming from labor, right? There has to be somebody doing that work so that somebody else then can profit. And in our example, rent, somebody has to pay, and it can't all be just at equal levels. And so uneven development means that profit is extracted from one location to benefit another location. And one thing about geographic theories is that it's really not one size fits all. As much as we can kind of talk about how the system works, there are different ways that it'll happen. So globally, you can think about how we outsource labor and then extract a lot of profit that we then benefit from, like here in the United States, from other countries. Or locally, we think about how one location might be paying good amounts of, or relatively high rent still, but they're not getting their buildings maintained, and thinking about how other neighborhoods are getting their buildings maintained. So even development of neighborhoods, right, if that's theoretically possible, would require that all neighborhoods are able to get equal resources. But that can't happen in a for-profit housing system, right? You can only profit so much from a certain location, and you've got to kind of, the way that housing and real estate works is that you've got to kind of extract as much profit as you can from one location. And then that has to come from somewhere. And so on the city level, like city governments, they get revenue from property and income taxes. So they need property values to increase, and they need wealthy people to move in. But especially because of neoliberalism and because of austerity politics and cuts to budgets, that they don't necessarily have the resources, I think that they could, but don't have the resources to invest equally in every neighborhood. And so gentrification then, using uneven development theory, was a spatial fix for capitalism's urban crisis, a way to profit from previous disasters and to find new places for investors to turn money into more money. And so the previous disasters that there's talking about there are like recessions or economic crisis or whatever happens in a neighborhood that makes a certain neighborhood deteriorate. The solution then is for cities who need that property value to go up, is then to bring in those developers and get them to raise the property values there, get wealthier people to move in. And so what that means by spatial fix is just basically a way that space could be utilized and that capitalists would invest in space. I know space can sound kind of vague, but generally just thinking of like those locations, right? That they could invest in new locations where they could profit from. And so for processes of uneven development locally, you can think of it as a cycle of investment, disinvestment, and reinvestment. Or you could refer to it as a cycle of investment, slumification, and gentrification. And I think in a lot of ways, those last terms are a little bit more accurate in a lot of times to what processes are actually happening, right? Because you could invest in a neighborhood in a way that is not gentrification, not so much in like the capitalist housing system, but you could pool your neighborhood resources and have like the neighborhood that you want to have. So it's really specific to like what's happening in a capitalist system there. So I wanted to give an example of a building that I personally lived in. The investment phase is when it's like first built. Those properties are first built. So the house on the left is a house that was built around the same time as the house on the right, which is a house, surprisingly. And that's right across the street from that. And so these were the Jocelyn's. They were like some important family in Omaha, one of like the founding families or whatever. And all their friends built these big houses all around this like castle that they built. But then there was an era of disinvestment. So a lot of those mansions and houses around there got turned into apartments. They got split up. And this was the apartment that I lived in. You can see that specific leak that it's showing was from when we had a fire above, but we used to have the plumbing and the ceiling collapse all the time. And then you get to see a cute picture of my cat, but that's just an example of our mattresses covered in plastic out in the living room because we had bed bugs, right? And so that was what was happening after that initial investment period for that disinvestment then. And then we got to a period of reinvestment and gentrification. This is what that apartment looks like now. I don't live there anymore because I can't afford to live there anymore. It like doubled in price because they put some new flooring in, right? So that's the reinvestment cycle then. So slumification, as part of the overall investment cycle that we just talked about, it sets up some neighborhoods for gentrification. As properties deteriorate, the amount of profit that can be made by flipping or renovations increases. So just, think about if something's cheaper to buy, obviously, then you're going to be able to make more if you're renovating the property or whatever. So landlords in slumifying neighborhoods profit through lowering costs, but not lowering price. So they don't do as much maintenance, they have lower taxes, but they're generally not charging that much lower of rent. And so this is a quote from the abstract of a article that found that the profit rates are actually higher in more poor neighborhoods because the rent is not that much lower, but the costs of maintaining those properties are so much lower. And then the flip side of that is gentrification, which reorients the purpose of cities away from being spaces that provide for the poor and middle classes and toward being spaces that generate capital for the rich. So basically one way to think about gentrification is like with that use and exchange value, services are not being provided for the purpose of meeting needs in that neighborhood. They're being provided for the purpose of capital. And so it's reinvestment in neighborhoods that raises the cost of living, resulting in wealthier people moving in and existing residents are displaced. But one thing that I think is important to point out, that especially using this theory, this is a process that happens at the developer and government level, not something that individuals do. Although of course, as individuals, we can all be complicit in those processes, but individuals don't just all individually decide to move to a specific neighborhood all across the country, all on their own. They're not just all waking up one day and making a decision to move to that neighborhood, right? Developers and cities are collaborating to pick neighborhoods that they want to market to wealthier people, and then individuals move in. And so in gentrification, they profit by raising the price then, even as costs are going up because they're doing more maintenance, paying more taxes often, et cetera. Although you can see, especially at the beginning of gentrification, sometimes the costs don't go up. Like, so those first levels, if things are happening in the neighborhood and stuff is getting nicer, often landlords will raise the rent without making any changes to the building, just because maybe a new coffee shop moved in next door. But eventually, if they want to keep attracting wealthier people to live there, they're probably going to have to start doing some more maintenance. So slumification is a prerequisite for gentrification, right? Those costs have to be low in order for somebody to then come in and like flip it or whatever. But not all slumifying neighborhoods gentrify. And the reason for that is rent gap theory, or is what would be considered one reason for that. So this means that gentrification occurs when the potential rent is higher than the actual rent. So like we were talking about with the speculation and how developers will just sit on properties, they're going to be sitting on properties that they think are going to get more expensive. And when we're talking about landlords and rent, gentrification happens if there is a potential to charge higher rent than what's being charged right now. And so you can think about reasons why potential rent might be higher or not higher. Has to do with that built environment. So that initial investment, if there are nice buildings there, that if people renovate them, then people are going to want them and they're going to want to pay more for them. The physical location, how close you are to whatever's happening in the city, the cool spots. Also existing demographics of residents. A lot of times neighborhoods obviously have like a specific racial or cultural like traditions and culture to them. And there are some interesting studies and works written about how developers make decisions about whether they can market those or not, about whether they can take those ethnicities and flatten them into something that people will think is then cool and hip, or if they don't think that they can do that, then they might not come into that neighborhood. So what really ends up mattering is whether the area is marketable to wealthier people.
Excellent. Thanks, Talia. So yeah, let's take another couple minutes to just think about these questions and take notes, and you can feel free to drop them into the chat, and then we'll get started with the conversation. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. And people, you can just add yourself to Stack in the chat. I'm seeing we've got at least one comment so far. Ryan, do you want to share your comment aloud?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm with the Pasadena Tenants Union. In my city, a neighborhood that's gentrifying is in the northwest of our community, which has historically been a Black community. And then in the 50s, two freeways totally crossed right through that neighborhood and displaced hundreds, if not thousands of families from that community. The neighborhood still feels the pain of that displacement, 60, 70 years later. It's still actively talked about in politics in Pasadena. And now there's gentrification beginning to happen. There's that rent gap that Talia was talking about, where the price that a future landlord can charge is so much higher than what's currently being charged. And so landlords, corporate landlords especially, with lots of disposable capital, are buying buildings, evicting everybody in the building, doing superficial renovations, and then literally doubling the rent. I was evicted without cause from a unit 3 years ago, and the rent doubled. And I think they changed, like you said, changed the floors or something. Like, it was really nothing. So I think there's a racial component as well in a lot of communities to this, especially if a city sees a particular group of people as devaluing the city or the neighborhood by their presence. It can be a subtext to remove people.
I think that's a really important point, Ryan. There's one book that I recommend that I feel like does a great job looking at that historically, called American Babylon by Robert Self. And I know someone requested that when we share the slides, we maybe share readings. I can include a link to that suggestion. And Rachel, I see that you're on Stack. I'm going to suggest we come back to you since you've had a couple comments already, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. So we'll jump to Linda. Is there a resource for us to, Linda, do you want to share your question actually?
Oh, okay. Is there a resource for us to, in our cities, to find out which buildings are not being used, are being used for income, for income as a tax write-off rather than actually housing residents. So I'd like to know if there's some buildings in Glendale that are just being held on to for future gentrification, or being used as tax write-offs. There are a lot of empty apartments in Glendale, but the housing costs are pretty high, so they're going to remain empty for quite some time. And I just want to be able to say in the city council meetings that this particular building has like 70% vacancy, but the landlord, and I'll say the landlord, is making money on it because of such and such and such. So I want to educate the people in the community when I go to these council meetings.
Does anyone have an answer to Linda's question? Is anybody familiar with a resource like that? I can say I'm not familiar. I think mostly I've heard sort of inside information. Sometimes you can really see, like when a newer building has signs up that are like constantly advertising leasing, that suggests maybe they have a lot of vacant units. But does anyone have an idea about a resource that would be useful for this, if there is one?
One
Yeah,
more,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, just lastly, I don't know how many units are vacant in a building. Can I even find that out some way? That seems like very private, close to the chest information.
Right, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one question might be like if whether people would have access to that if they're getting some kind of government subsidy, whether there's that people have a right to get that information from the city planning department or the local housing authority or something like that. That would be maybe one guess, but purely private buildings, yeah, I can't think of anything like that. Jordan, do you have a comment on Linda's point here? All right, I'm also seeing Ricky actually. Why don't you go ahead, Ricky?
I was just gonna say, I just wanted to add that I also would like resources on this because I've noticed that in places where there aren't programs to track vacancies or allocations for that already, they're like really fighting our access to that information because they know that it's important. And I think the vacancy thing is specific versus like whether something is for profit or not, because I think it's worth mentioning that like all of the housing we're dealing with for the most part is actually for profit. It's just we're looking at different new kinds of extraction that are maybe worse, but that doesn't make the other stuff not also extractive in that way, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's pedantic or not, but I always try to remember that.
Thanks, Ricky. Okay, so we've got a few people on stack. Let's move on to the next comment. Mitch, I think you were on next.
Yeah, hi everyone. Mitch Sheehan from Denver. To Linda's questions, yeah, all that I've seen have been really like intensive canvassing efforts on for vacancies, or also again like inside information from tenants in those buildings. That's at least all I've seen. Again, not to speak to the tools that others have spoken about. One thing I wanted to say that's sort of interesting in Denver is the ways in which even the potential for future gentrification is becoming like financialized in itself. Like Denver, and I can't really compare it to other locations, but Denver's one of it's really growing fast, and it's one of the, I think it was said, one of the top 2 gentrifying cities in the US over like the last decade or so. And there's this complex, this huge 1,000-unit complex that was bought for like $125 million back in 2016. And they've just been slumifying it, basically keeping those rents up because there's a lot of, a lot of commuters who need to live there to get to their jobs at the airport and other places. But no renovations whatsoever, just really bad, deteriorating conditions there. And they just sold it. So over 4 years, they made $40 million in profit. So it's again, it's sort of like in some situations, it feels like these processes are kind of getting like combined in real time.
That was helpful, Mitch. Alessandra, I see you on stack on this.
Oh, it was actually stacked to what Ricky had said. And so anybody from LA, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, sorry, that's my dog trying to fight for my attention. As far as I know, LA doesn't keep track of their vacancy records, and they do so like very kind of intentionally. And I know like they have some ideas of their vacancies from like census data, but it's been like an ongoing fight to get them to report on this because we don't have any adequate numbers. Like the only one I can think of is from CoStar, which reports on like LA's like vacancy like figures, but they don't seem completely accurate. Because I know for like the majority of downtown, I used to do like a lot of work catering, and you have buildings that are like 50, 60 level like high rises, and like 7/10 of it are empty. And it's like that's just like the overwhelming like majority of shit. And I know there's also been like studies of that advocates for like unhoused neighbors have like published about the amount of vacant units like available in the city compared to the amount of unhoused like folks on the street, and how we could house the entire unhoused community like a few times over.
Rachel, do you want to come in with your comment at this point?
Sure. My comment is about community amenities, and in disenfranchised neighborhoods, at least here in LA, people push their electeds to get parks, open spaces, better schools, playgrounds, et cetera, but once those amenities are created, that makes the whole area more attractive to developers. So then now they come in and they start buying up and renovating, and that whole cycle of gentrification happens. And so as someone who is looking at running for higher office, I'm been trying to wrap my head around how do we improve our communities without displacing, the people who live there, and it just really, I just have not been able to come up with a satisfactory answer to this.
Thanks for that, Rachel. And Cheryl, do you want to share your question? Or I can just read it and see if someone's got an answer. What typically causes the move from initial investment to slumification? Is there a specific theory around that? Anyone got a comment on that? I can share what my knowledge. I mean, I think typically, it's a huge initial investment, right? When a building's renovated, and so unless there's sort of like a renewed opportunity to kind of squeeze additional profit out of further reinvesting, there'll be a tendency for there to be like a period of investment in a neighborhood, and then all the landlords will just sort of let the buildings kind of, they'll grind out all the profit they can from those buildings, and then they'll just deteriorate over time. Maybe they'll do basic maintenance as long as that stays a hot neighborhood, and then, eventually people may, for whatever reason, another neighborhood may become more popular, or, financial crash occurs, different reasons. And then, the time passes and the buildings deteriorate. And then you have, at a certain point, it's no longer a hot neighborhood. It's no longer worth reinvesting in from the landlord's point. And so then they kind of go to a slumifying strategy when it kind of hits that threshold. And actually one useful tool about that kind of shows this a little bit is there's a map associated with this, a report called American Neighborhood Change in the 21st Century, that kind of shows which places are gentrifying, which places are slumifying around the country. Okay, and I see that there's quite a number of people on Stack here still. We are run past the 15 minutes here, so if we can come back to some of these questions if we have additional time in the next section. And I'm actually presenting this next section, I realize. Cool, thanks. So what does all this mean for tenant organizers? Our goal is not just to help each other negotiate. We want more than that. We want to end landlordism. We want housing as a human right. So this big question is, what could housing as a human right look like? What does it look like to provide that as a reality to people? And there's some different ideas. I think a lot of these are kind of connected. One is this idea of decommodified housing. And I think there was a great question earlier, which we didn't get time to talk about. What does decommodified really even look like? Well, we know at the very least, it would be housing provided for need, not for profit. So another example of what it would look like for housing as a human right is if nobody had to pay rent. And kind of coming with these ideas kind of a little beyond, but including these kind of notions specific to tenants is the right to the city idea. And here's a quote from David Harvey about that. The right to the city is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape urbanization. Yeah, so how do we get decommodified housing? How do we stop paying rent permanently? How do we, make a right to the city a real right? How do we make housing a human right? Well, we organize. And we can use theories to help us learn about what the problem is so that we can come up with solutions. So we've kind of considered some theories already in terms of thinking about the problem. And it's also important to have kind of theories that help us think about what solutions look like. So one group of theories that address that are theories of power or theories of change. And some important questions when you're considering a theory of power is who has what kinds of power. So, landlords have the power to extract rent. They also have the influence over the police. Tenants, have numbers. We also have the ability to not pay rent. We have the ability to, call the press with, show them pictures of what's going on in our situation. So there's some examples. How does change happen? Does it happen by voting? Does it happen by what happens in the business offices of the landlord? Does it happen through the meetings that tenants have with each other, through the direct actions that tenants take? And how are some kinds of change different from others? So, are they long-term? Are they short-term? That sort of thing. So this is kind of a little spectrum here. So different folks in society have different kinds of power, broadly speaking, or have access to different kinds of power, broadly speaking. So on the left side, we have proletarians, people who have no choice but to work or, don't have capital. And then the ruling classes, which include, of course, landlords and capitalists on the other side. So organizing is really, in our view, our strongest weapon. We don't have money. We don't necessarily have influence except in our neighborhoods. And we can mobilize that influence by making connections, by building tenant unions, by building tenant councils, and kind of pushing that. Then kind of next to that, it's a tool that a lot of folks can use, including us as part of our organizing, but it doesn't necessarily mobilize our unique power, which is our numbers, activism and mobilizing. So that's about taking actions and turning out the people we're already connected with. So that works especially well for people who are already connected. But we also know that one of the unfortunate effects of capitalism is that we're divided from each other socially in a lot of cases, and so we really have to build that connection in the first place. And then kind of more on the side of ruling classes, maybe middle class. We're talking about what a lot of nonprofits do. They provide advocacy around legal change. They provide services for people that they deem to be needy. So we can sometimes get a little benefit from those things, but that's ultimately not something that we have access to, and doesn't really rely on our strengths in a lot of cases. And then ruling classes, what do they have? Well, they have money, they have power. So they can lobby, they can pay people to persuade politicians, and they can, make trades. I'll make sure you get these votes. I'll make sure that your campaign gets this donations. I'll make sure, that they can trade the power that they have. So kind of the next thing here to kind of stitch together the earlier parts with where we're at now, we can actually know things about what kinds of tenant issues tend to exist where different kinds of urban change is happening. So we know there are certain kinds of issues that are characteristic of gentrification. So those include increasing rents, rent evictions. That's like when an eviction happens by the landlord saying they're going to renovate the place. Regular evictions, a lot of people will be in tenant unions where there aren't much eviction protections, or even if there are, landlords find a way to get around them. Demolitions, new developments, displacement, loss of culture, increased police presence. So displacement, of course, people getting pushed out of their neighborhoods, which has a negative consequence on the culture in that neighborhood. The historical population are really the carriers of the culture of a place. And people are attracted to a neighborhood for that. But then when the rents rise and people have to leave or evictions happen, we lose that culture. And police, you play a unique part of gentrification.
That clearing out some of the books that I've read and taking them up north so that my parents can read them is just going to have the effect of
isn't supposed to. And of course, they incarcerate people and so forth. Landlord harassment is also a key tool of gentrification. Landlords also like to rely on the police to do some of their harassment, and selling buildings can also be an issue. And then on the other side, slumification also has characteristic issues. So big ones really, as some of the examples Talia showed from her apartment earlier, maintenance repairs, bugs and mice and pests, landlord intimidation, particularly landlord intimidation in response to making repair requests. And sometimes that comes to the point of retaliation against tenants. Landlords also have a better chance of getting away with stolen deposits because people have less access to legal resources. And they may not know their rights more so in slumifying neighborhoods. Also, landlords like to steal from the deposits by imposing cleaning and move-out fees that are excessive. Landlords may not even be around, may be hard to reach when you have a problem or want to get your deposit back. There may be a lack of access to resources, so maybe you don't have, there's not a lot of access to legal aid versus landlords can kind of get lawyers whenever they need. You're also dealing, in some cases with police problems. Neighborhoods, as we know, can be criminalized on the basis of poverty and race, and that can lead to negative consequences. Of course, mass incarceration among them, and neglect by authorities. So, maybe the fancy new neighborhood, the inspector is really responsive, but the slumifying neighborhood, the inspectors don't come by, and maybe you don't even necessarily want them to come, because if they come, maybe that's going to end up in a retaliatory eviction. Yeah. So, you kind of have a knowledge of what some of the issues are, usually, but by experience and kind of just knowing what kind of change is happening in an area. So the first thing that's important is you want to have a sense of what's happening, so you can make a guess about what's going to be an effective way to agitate the tenants that you're going to meet in the neighborhood you're organizing in. And you can make guesses about that based on whether it seems like gentrification is happening, slumification is happening, or something else. And when you have that estimation, then you're going to be prepared to talk about those issues. So you want to kind of have a sense of what really are the important issues for the tenants in the neighborhood, and you want to make sure your flyers really speak to that. So while rent may be rising in a gentrifying neighborhood, maybe rising rent isn't super relevant to tenants who live in public housing or tenants who live in a slumifying neighborhood. Maybe you want to foreground repair issues and so forth. And then once you get to know some tenants, once you're organizing with them, you want to make sure the tenants are taking the lead in what happens instead of the problems that they're dealing with. So maybe they want to stop evictions, maybe they want to stop a demolition. Maybe they want to get repairs done or fight for lower rent if, as a lot of places are happening right now, maybe the rents are declining because of departure due to COVID. Maybe someone got a rent increase and they have the ability to fight it because they have had neglected repairs for a long time, or maybe there's something illegal about the rent increase. Maybe I know a lot of places require that rent increases be on paper. Or maybe the tenants even feel like we're in position to actually try to buy the building. We know it's up for sale, and maybe we can get connection with a community land trust or some other group like that to make that possible. Whatever it is, you want to work with the tenants to make a plan. So then when you're planning, you want to be thinking about strategy. And there's this useful quote from the book Why David Sometimes Wins by Marshall Gantz, which I think is about the Cesar Chavez organizing with the farm workers. And this is kind of a principle of strategy. It's about turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. So here, kind of breaking those parts down, what you have, what power do you already possess? So maybe you possess power in numbers. Maybe you possess power in, maybe you have built strong relationships with a newspaper where you live. Who's on your side? Well, of course, tenants are probably on your side. Who else? Are there any politicians that might be in a position to help you? Are there any, maybe there's one inspector that you know in the building department that's like actually legit and not gonna, you know, mess with you guys if you have some repair issues you need to report. What you need. So how much power will it take to win? And that's probably going to have to do with what your demand is. So, you know, other part is to think about these different components of strategy in relation. You know, so is it going to take, you know, mobilizing all your union members plus some of your allies, or is it going to be enough to just send a letter? And you want to think about that in relation to the actions that you want to take. And that's, you know, kind of when you can judge how much power you have and how much you need, you can start putting together a plan to win. So, you know, maybe we can win in a month if we are able to get our, you know, friends at, you know, the local DSA chapter and the local Marxist Center group. And maybe we're going to call on members of a base building nonprofit. And if we can get all of them, and we can maybe, you know, do an action at the landlord's house, maybe that's enough to win. And then, of course, very important, what is the demand that the tenants actually have? And of course, what you want is going to be related to what you have. You know, maybe what you're looking at is poor living conditions, and what you have is power in numbers, and what you like would be repairs, and you've got some allies. So you kind of put that demand out there and mobilize all your parts for your strategy. So here's another kind of breakdown of strategy a little deeper. So the first thing to think about is, you know, this is kind of the what you have part, your organization. How many members do you have? What neighborhoods are you strong in? How do decisions happen in your group? Who takes on tasks? And kind of knowing that will help you really be able to judge, you know, what you're actually capable of doing, what's realistic for you and what's not. And it's important to kind of both have stretch goals, but also, you know, fight campaigns that you can actually win. So then on the other side, you want to think about your targets. So, you know, maybe your primary target is the landlord or property manager, but you also want to think about secondary targets. Maybe you're talking about the building inspector's office or politicians, and you want to think about, you know, what they have going for them and what their vulnerabilities are. So after you've thought about that, you also want to think about your partners. Who has the same goal as you, for what reasons? So again, maybe, you know, you have some members who are part of other organizations. We mentioned possibly DSA, Marxist Center groups. Maybe people are part of nonprofits. Maybe they're students and they have, you know, a lot of people they know at school or student groups who has the same goals as you, and who has the same goal as you for different reasons. That's important to know because sometimes when you share a goal, you know, you can only take the collaboration so far. So you want to be able to anticipate, okay, well, you know, how do we need to message around this goal in order to connect with this ally while also, you know, kind of meeting our needs and achieving our goals. And then the last part here, SWOT analysis. So it's SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a way of thinking about strategy, kind of piecing together some of these parts. So strengths, you know, maybe strengths of your organization and your partner. So, you know, power in numbers is one we've already mentioned. Maybe you have a lot of recognition in your neighborhood. Maybe you have a lot of allies. Weaknesses, maybe you don't have access to a lot of funds, so you can't run an expensive campaign that would rely on making a lot of printing or something like that. Maybe you don't have, maybe a weakness is, you know, there aren't very many tenant protections where you live. And so if the landlord decides to, they could retaliate against the tenants by evicting them. That's another important weakness to consider. And then external, you include opportunities and threats. So, you know, an opportunity may be something like, you know, the specific moment you're in. Like right now, we're in the pandemic moment, and a lot of people are actually listening to tenant issues in a way that it seems like, you know, it hasn't been a huge, not everywhere at least, hasn't been something that's paid attention to. So maybe you have the opportunity to get a publication to listen and publicize your fight that you haven't had before. Opportunities may also have to do with the weaknesses of a landlord specifically. So let's say, you know, this landlord really, you know, likes to have a good image around town, but actually they're kind of slumlords. And so you have the opportunity there to publicize the poor quality housing that they provide their tenants. And maybe you can, you know, use that on secondary targets. So you can let the politicians that they like to pal around with, or, you know, some of their business partners, know what's going on with that. Another opportunity could be maybe the landlord owns other businesses that you could disrupt. And then last would be threats. So threats might be, I actually think the eviction thing I mentioned before is probably more characteristic of a threat. So the landlord could threaten your organizing by trying to evict tenants. And yeah, the overall kind of point here is that you can kind of, if you have a sense of the overall, you know, kind of development that's happening, if you have a sense of what kind of commodity, housing commodity your landlord's providing, you know, is it regular commodified? Is it hyper commodified? Are they relying on bank loans, that kind of thing? Those can help you assess some of these components. You know, what are the interests of the landlord? You know, what are the issues of your organization? What are some of the strengths you have? You know.
So for discussion, we have about 10 minutes left in this presentation. And I just wanted to say that I am pretty happy to stick around after and talk through some more specific questions that people have about the presentation and share resources. But if y'all want to think about some of these questions now, so as we wrap up, we can kind of just contextualize things. So what's happening in your own neighborhood? What would you like to see happening instead? Because I think as tenant organizers, we're often going to be going and talking to other tenants, but I think it's very important that we think about ourselves as tenants as well. Like, we're members of the community, and so what would we be doing in these situations? So think about who in your neighborhood might have those same goals, how you could use an organizing theory of power to get those goals done, what organizational structure might be best, and then what does right to the city really mean to you? And we'll give a couple minutes to think about those, and I think we might, if anybody kind of has an answer to the last question, let's discuss that in a couple minutes. Okay, I think we can go ahead and start chatting. Does anybody want to share what right to the city means to you? And again, after about these next 5 minutes, I'm happy to answer some more specific questions too. Jose.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Gosh, I think it's so interesting in like a founding convention like this, right? Or when big questions are being talked about, to talk about concepts of rights and even to have a rights-based framework of justice, I think is like an interesting question, or something at least not to be assumed from the beginning is the only way to deal with like questions of justice. I think there's also interesting questions of power in this framework. This is the second conference in this block I've jumped into, and both seem to be using kind of the same language, same slideshows, talking about power, and maybe missing a component that seems really powerful to me, which is like the capitalist base of it in this game we're playing, which is that everybody pays rent every month and provides the income for these landlords and is the generator of that power. And I like what these three words, autonomous tenant and union. And I think the union part that gets it right is they know the power of the strike, right? And that may be diluted currently in a United States, America, but it's, yeah, it's real. The power of the strike, the power to stop paying their fucking income. And who's doing it and how do we do that? And the power, everything else is the activism, everything else is the protest and the shame and this other, they're good when they work. If they don't work, they don't care, it doesn't work, like, but it's not the power. It's not where power lies. That's it.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to share?
Maybe I'll jump in. This is Julian from the Northeast local of Latu. Maybe picking up a little bit on what Jose is saying, but also trying to answer the question, Talia, of what does the right to the city mean? I think it's interesting that that phrase, you know, that kind of picked up as one of its main origin places from this book in The Right to the City by Henri Lefebvre. What kind of gets left out often in discussions of the right to city is that there's a political subject that fights for the right to the city. So I think that that's an idea to hold on to. Lefebvre calls it like the inhabitant. But then what he does that often gets forgotten, and this connects to what Jose was just saying, is like, it's working class people. There's a working class inhabitant that is the political subject for this project of the right to the city. So for me, I guess the right to the city would be working people whose labor is being extracted in the form of rent. So for back to Jose's point, what's one origin of our power? I mean, I disagree only with one thing I think Jose said, that the way we're defining tenants, I think it's not just rent. So, we also are talking about unhoused people who aren't being directly extracted, who don't necessarily have the power to strike. But that's not to, I assume, like also what Jose is discussing. But I think the right to the city, it has to do with identifying ourselves as a class, as a working class, and struggling on that basis, and seeing that the commodification of housing isn't an economic fact, it's a political project. And so we need a political project for ourselves that we can juxtapose and acknowledge as a political project. It's a little vague. Sorry about that, but
Oh, absolutely, thank you. And Latu is in stack.
Hi, this is Nico. My pronouns are he, him. I kind of wanted to respond to that because I think an analysis about class in America is kind of ignoring the fact that it might be more accurate to say we have a caste system than a class system. I think the kind of ideas around class are something we often see with Marxism and with like traditional sort of thought around how society is divided. But I think if you look to other countries and other ways of creating hierarchy and creating oppression, I think a caste is maybe a more accurate way to see like the racial divide and the divide in power and oppression that we have. And organizing along those lines, organizing along cultural lines is super important. So earlier we had this question come up in like our breakout group about this idea of shame and how shame is like a barrier to recognizing power and like taking control as a tenant and as a member of a union. But then there's also this question of, well, shame is also like it's culturally very different for different people. So like that becomes a component to our organizing and to our thinking around creating, you know, ideas of solidarity. Also has to be like, I think, keeping in mind always that these things are different for different people.
Well, stack is empty, so I think I'll call that good in terms of the, oh, Alessandra, if you want to go really quickly, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just really quickly, I was just wondering, you know, thinking about, I was really fortunate and I had the time to tune into a talk that UCLA was giving called Abolition on Stolen Land, and just hearing specifically like Charles Sepulveda, who talking about, you know, when we're talking about abolition, we're talking about abolition of like commodified housing, you know, how also that fits in, you know, to recognizing, acknowledging, and trying to further, you know, Indigenous people's calls for land back and Indigenous sovereignty. And I just, you know, wanted to pose that question to like the larger group, because like, you know, to right of the city, I mean, even just the phrasing of it, you know, I'd like it's a larger concept, but like, you know, right of the, do we have a right to this place? And so like, you know, creating kind of like social housing in a place, you know, for all people, but also acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty and land back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love this discussion because I think one thing this is really bringing up is who's right, and what does that mean to have a right to the city, and you know who should get to have that right. Not that you know, people shouldn't all have rights if things are rights, you know, but right to the city is also not talking as much in the traditional sense of like a human right. So I think that it brings up those questions of power and who and everything. So thank you everybody for this discussion. And like I said, I'll stick around a little bit if people have other questions and can share some more resources. I'll throw my email in the chat too. But otherwise, I think that's it for the like official presentation. And I'm happy to stick around until maybe a little bit after 4, because I'm going to go to one of those 4:15 presentations myself, I think. So if anyone wants to hang out and chat, feel free.
I could talk for a minute.